So, your book idea. It's been burning inside of you for months, maybe years, but starting it up feels impossible. But what if you had an amazing collaborator with you 24/7? A collaborator that was an amazing ghostwriter, editor, and cheerleader. And what if that collaborator was an expert at almost every subject? Well, that's exactly what we're going to build today using AI. This video is going to be broken down into 4 parts. First of all, preparing to write your book, writing the book, the all-important editing, and finally, the finishing section. In the preparation section of this video, we are going to look at the technical limitations of large language models when it comes to writing such long pieces of content. Then we're going to get into choosing the right tool that's most appropriate for this task. And finally, in this section, we're going to look at researching and fact-checking. As everybody knows, these tools are great, but they can make stuff up. So there's a lot of ways we can get around that. We're going to cover all that in the prep section. Then we're going to get into the writing section, starting with plotting and outlining, using the AI to help brainstorm your story structure or the structure of your nonfiction book. From there, we're going to be looking at breaking it down further because the large language models can't really generate a full normal chapter in their normal responses. So we'll look at techniques we can use to break the chapters into smaller parts. If this is fiction, these might be scenes. If it's nonfiction, these might be subsections of each chapter. And then we're going to get into drafting it, looking at the tone and style, which is often a challenge with large language models. In part 3, we're going to be looking at editing. So I think this is one of the major challenges people face with large language models is not being able to use it as a good editing tool. And that's because there are many different types of editing. So we're going to break that down. Again, I believe this is the most important part of the video, looking at large edits down to proofreading and technical editing. And finally, in part 4, the finishing stage, we're going to be looking at ethics and plagiarism. We're going to be looking at a few special notes on fiction, and this is where we'll be focusing on the toolbox that Stephen King describes in his book. We're going to be looking at other techniques that you can use to bring some of the best of what fiction writers have learned to entice your readers to read your nonfiction book. And then we're going to look at the future of AI in writing. If you're new to the Blazing Zebra channel, I want to welcome you and thank you for joining me on my mission of helping writers, entrepreneurs, lifelong learners, and marketers learn to use these powerful new AI tools. I've got a cheat sheet version of this video and all of my other videos along with some coaching options available to my Patreon supporters. By becoming a Patreon supporter, you get immediate access to this cheat sheet and all of the other cheat sheets. So if you're getting something out of these videos, please consider checking out my Patreon options. There's a link in the description to all that. So the technical limitations, really just the length of this, as you've probably dabbled with AI and know that it can create, short social media blurbs. But building a book is a much different story here. So I did a bunch of research to prepare for this video and trying to figure out what is a book? How long is a book? So business bestsellers are about 50,000 words on average, and they fluctuate between 30,000 and 60 or 70,000. There's a lot of variation with these. So, take all of this with a grain of salt, but we got to start somewhere and figuring out what our target is. Ebooks, obviously much shorter. They're in the realm of 10,000 words, and fiction is about 90,000 words on average, novels. But again, that can vary all over the place, and especially if you're getting into different genres, for younger audiences, that can be shorter. Diving into the chapters, how long is an average chapter? For business bestsellers, they range from about 1,000 words, being a pretty short chapter, to 3,000 words, being a pretty long chapter. Fiction usually falls between 1,000 and 5,000, so the very short in the fiction would be 2,000 words. This creates a faster paced feel. You can think of James Patterson. Standard is somewhere in between 2,000 and 4,000 words. And then the very long chapters are 4,000 to 5,000. These are the epic narratives. You might think of J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings, things like that. So in summary, business bestsellers, 50,000 words per book. You can think of that as roughly 25 chapters of 2,000 words each. Again, you can adjust this however you want. Fiction, 90,000 word book, 30 chapters, 3,000 words each. Ebook, 10,000 word ebook, 10 chapters, 1,000 words each. So if you're looking to just build a download, a lead magnet, that type of thing, that's a rough idea of your target there. So, as you know, you can't just ask the AI to write you a book. There are some limitations there. The context window is the one that gets spoken about quite a lot, and then the response length is one that I think is even more of a limiting factor, and that doesn't get talked about hardly at all, which is interesting to me because I think that is more of a limiting factor currently than the context window, as these context windows get larger and larger. So the context window is essentially the AI's working memory, and then the response length is typically what the AI responds with. That can be anywhere between 200 and 500 words on average. I've seen it up to about 700 or 800 words, but still that's shorter than really even a short chapter of most books. So that, I think, is the main limitation here. When it gets to context windows, OpenAI's ChatGPT-4 is really not a good choice for this because the ChatGPT-4, the web version, we're not talking about the API version, that context window is only about 6,000 words, making it one of the shortest and smallest memories of any of these frontier foundational models here. ChatGPT Plus previously had 32,000 and the Enterprise previously had 128,000, but this has been shrinking as far as my research can tell. And these are not the easiest stats to find. These companies do not publish these all the time because they're clear differentiators of one versus the other. So while I think ChatGPT is great for a lot of things, writing a book may not be one of them. If this is your only tool you have access to, you may want to try to use the API. I believe in the API version, which is at platform.openai.com. In there, you may be able to access a version of GPT-4 that does not have such a small context window. Gemini, just over the course of creating this video, Gemini's context window has increased. So, as of a couple days ago, it was roughly 94,000 words. So the idea here is that you want this context window to be able to hold your entire book in its memory, or as much of that as you possibly can. And flipping back here to ChatGPT-4, with only 6,000 words, that's not going to get you there. You're going to struggle endlessly, I think, with that, or just really have to do a lot of manual work. You could really probably use it to help you write a chapter, but then, getting the continuity between the chapters is going to be challenging. Flipping here back into Gemini with this 94,000 word context window, roughly, you could probably get a whole novel in there, and it can probably have the whole novel in its working memory. It's been tested. Gemini 1.5 has been tested successfully, they say, up to 10 million tokens. So that would be mini books, and these are just climbing all the time. Just in the last couple days, they started to release this 1 million token version of Gemini. So Gemini may be a good tool for this, although that stuff is very new. Anthropic's Claude, I believe this to be the best bet. It currently has a roughly 146,000 word context window, so it should be able to hold the entire book in its memory if it's not like a massive book, but your average novel and for sure your average business bestseller, it can hold almost 3 of your average business bestsellers in its context window. Also, what I really like about Claude is that it seems to be a good writer compared to the others, that it, I believe, has been trained on essays more than the others. And I've always thought of it as my writing intern. So this is the tool we're going to be focusing on today, this Claude 3 Opus. This is their most advanced model, I think is the best tool for writing a book. And if you're really going to dive into such a massive undertaking, you probably want to invest in the right tool here. And I believe Claude 3 Opus is the best tool for writing a book. That being said, this is going to be, writing a book is not easy. It's not going to be as easy as using AI to write a piece of social media. This takes work and it will be a time-intensive process. However, proper use of AI should dramatically increase the speed at which you can create the book. And I would argue could probably increase the quality as well. I feel like a lot of folks think about this trade-off between quality and speed. But for me, being able to use the AI has helped me see how other readers might interpret what I write, and it helps as a third party, somewhat unbiased third party point of view that I can run ideas by. And that I think has really strengthened a lot of what I do, but definitely the writing side of it. Okay, so that was looking at everything from the context window limitation. Now, I think probably the more critical limitation is the response length. So this is the amount of words that the large language model returns. And on average, it's somewhere in the realm of 200 to 500 words. Again, you can get that up a little bit higher, but that is far shorter than even a short chapter. So we need to break things down even further. So when you think about if you're writing a business book, these business bestsellers is what I sort of focused on from a nonfiction side of things. We're also going to cover fiction as well here. But thinking about outlining your business bestseller into 25 chapters, and think about roughly a 10-point outline for each chapter. Maybe those fit into 3 or 4, major points per chapter. 1 point equals 1 response. Then even on the very short side of the response, if you're only getting 200 words per response, you're still at a 2,000 words per chapter and a 50,000 word book. Easy enough, right? But the devil's in the details. I hedged very low on the words per response. I know that you can force it to generate well over 200, again, up into the 700 or 800 range. But I feel like the more words you push it to generate, the less quality of the response, because one of the major limitations right now is the amount of compute that goes into each response. So the amount of energy and processing power that they allocate, that these creators of these large language models allocate to each response. And that's the limitation that we're running up against. And if you can get them to allocate as much of that compute, as much as that resources to each word, you're going to get, I believe, a higher quality response. So again, pushing it to generate a whole lot of words per response, yeah, you might speed things up a little bit, but the quality may be poor and you may require more editing than if you try to really get high quality out of each response, so that then when you knit together the chapter, you've got some solid stuff to work with when you get into the editing phase. Fiction, similarly, we're thinking about maybe an outline of about 30 chapters with a 15-point outline for each chapter. You may want to think of those as scenes, or you may just want to get a little bit more creative with how you think about, the plot twists and the dialogue and the sections per chapter. And again, thinking about each response being roughly 200 words, that's on the low side. Then you're at 30,000 words per chapter, 90,000 word book. So definitely an undertaking still, but this will speed up your process. Ebook gets much easier. And if you are writing stuff for business purposes, this is probably a good place to start. See if you can crank out a good 10,000 word ebook, 10 chapters, 5 points per chapter, each point being 1 response. And that gets you there to your 10,000 word ebook. And this can be a great, lead magnet. This can serve a lot of purposes for this longer form content. And similarly, if you're focused on fiction, maybe you want to start with a short story, a novella of 10,000 words, and get through that first before you tackle your masterpiece. All right, so starting with your idea, I did a video recently that I will link to right now here in this video that is all about Rick Rubin's book, The Act of Creation and Building Custom GPTs to Help You Generate Ideas. So if you really don't know what to write about, I would go back and check that video out, as it goes into kind of observing the world around you, observing maybe it's your industry or maybe it's just your life in general, to get great ideas. Once you have a good idea, then we're getting into the research and fact-checking phase here. Okay, so jumping into the cheat sheet, this one is jam-packed with well over 100 prompts. This is my most intensive cheat sheet yet. This I actually checked and came in under almost 10,000 words itself. So this is basically an ebook, would be a more accurate description of this. But it includes a ton of prompts that we're not going to be able to get into today. And my Patreon subscribers have immediate access to this, so they can grab these, easily copy and paste them into AI tools such as Claude, as I'm going to show you today. So it saves a ton of time that way. You can see it has everything we went into here just as a quick reference, so you can just get to work really quickly without having to watch the video over and over again. So for each of these, I'm just going to be usually grabbing the first prompt. That's going to be the core prompt of each section. I'll go slow, so even if you can't support the Patreon, I understand. You can maybe grab some screenshots, etc. Okay, so I'm grabbing this first prompt. I'm considering writing a book loosely based on X theme. Can you help me generate a list of subtopics, historical events, or intriguing information related to this? I am putting this into Claude 3 Opus. And for today's example, I am going to be focused on dogs appearing in literature. I would like to work on a book about dogs appearing in literature. I know a lot of people who love to read and a lot of people that love dogs, and I think a book like this could just crush it. So these are all pretty much great, but I especially like 1 through 9. So I'm going to say I really like 1 through 9 the most. Can you help me hone in on the core concept of this book based on these? All right, and now in just a couple prompts, we've gone from a very basic idea, exploring some different aspects of that idea, honing that idea in, and then it even gave us some other aspects to go out and research. So I'd suggest spending, an hour or two just gathering research before we move on to the next phase. In the cheat sheet, I have a ton of other prompts, understanding your why. Why are you writing this book? Common challenges people have about your topic. Others focused on gathering research and information based on certain time periods, based on certain characters, exploring different sources here, and organizing and making different connections, synthesizing the information that you've pulled together. You want to be specific, you want to iterate, and you want to engage the large language models and make sure that they are thinking critically. And now we're getting into the plotting and outlining phase, using the AI to help you visualize your story structure. So as we mentioned, we want to break this down into your different chapters, your different plot points. And once we have this, we'll be able to keep breaking it down further so that we can get the large language model to help us with the drafts. But outlining is the first step. And then this is the large prompt here that I came up with for this section. I'm writing a nonfiction book about X subject. My thesis statement is X. Can you generate a few variations in the chapter outline, target audience, purpose, potential approaches? I also have a version of this for fiction. I'm writing a genre novel. If you're just looking to write a general novel, you might say literary fiction on a certain subject. My concept is X. Here are some additional details to consider. Audience, theme, tone, obstacles. Can you generate a few outlines of plot points, etc.? So that's the fiction prompt. Since this book I'm writing, even though it's about fictional dogs, it is a nonfiction book. So we'll copy this into Claude, see what we get. And it has generated a couple variations of a 24-chapter outline to support this thesis statement. This is cool. I like this first variation. Second variation is a little bit different. You may want to break that into various prompts, separate prompts where you're saying, one variation and then another variation, steering it in different directions. You might want to use these prompts to help it define your core message during this phase. You might want to maybe do a brainstorm or a mind map, kind of go in a lot of different directions and explore what the best outline approach might be, and then establish a tentative structure. On the fiction side of things, you might want to expand on your idea by asking it to give you 5 potential conflicts that could arise, or common themes to your genre if you're writing in a specific genre, plot development, character development. We'll get into this more later on in the video. But once you have your plot figured out, or your outline, if it's a nonfiction book, we need to break it down even smaller, because the responses are not long enough to be able to create an entire chapter for each response. So we need to break each chapter into smaller pieces. If that's a nonfiction book, this could be the different subsections of that chapter. If it is a fiction book, this could be the different scenes or the different plot points that need to unfold in each chapter. And here's the core prompt for that. I'm writing a chapter of my book about X. The main point I'd like to make is X. Create a detailed outline for this chapter, including subheadings and potential supporting points. Please include sections that focus on, some of the main things you've identified. Maybe you don't have those, you can leave that out. On the fiction side of things, here's the prompt I like to use for that. I'm writing a chapter of my novel, which is protagonist, Sarah, etc. Gives you a little bit about that chapter. The main point of this chapter is to put in whatever the main point is here. The following also needs to be achieved, and you can put sort of these subplot points in there as well. And then you ask it to please create a detailed outline for this chapter with a focus on suspenseful pacing or whatever you want it to focus on. Attached is a document with additional information, including a complete outline of chapter descriptions. We'll get to that in a second as we start to make sure the large language model knows what we are aiming at by adding different documents to its knowledge base and or its context window. And after some light editing, this is the prompt that I've come up with to continue this process of writing this book about dogs in literature. I'm writing a chapter of my book about the symbolism of dogs in ancient literature and mythology. Create a detailed outline for this chapter, including subheadings and potential supporting points. Awesome. And now feels like a good time to start dumping some of this into a Google Doc. So some additional things you might want to think about while you're breaking it down: summarizing main ideas, generating lists of questions that a chapter should answer for the reader, section ideas, getting it to pontificate on what each chapter should include. On the fiction side of things, suggesting potential obstacles or setbacks that your character could encounter, examples of subtle details or interactions that could cast further suspicion on certain characters. And these are all different characters from that initial prompt here. Also just continuing to refine character development, setting the scene and atmosphere, pacing and structure. And now we're really getting into it with the first draft for tone and style. And as far as the style goes, I think uploading an example is much better than trying to describe the style. If you think about the ways these large language models work, each word that you put in there is accessing tons and tons and tons of other ideas in their training data. So when you try to describe a tone, I've found it challenging, and a lot of the people that I have worked with have found that challenging. But if you can just give it an example saying, hey, match this example, or maybe you give it a few different examples, then you have a much better chance of it creating something that you actually like. Because just like when you're writing, you want to show and don't tell as one of the main rules of writing, and one of the maxims that comes up all the time. I think that also applies to large language models. So you may start with just a piece of writing from an author that you like, that you're trying to mimic, and then work through one chapter and get that chapter tightened up as much as you can, and then start to use your own chapters as the style that you are trying to match. So taking out the example of an author that you're trying to mimic and replacing that with your own chapters that you've worked through that you're very proud of. That way you're really building your own originality, building your own voice, but also steering the large language model in a good direction. Along those lines, if you're writing something for your business, here are a list of authors that you might want to consider, because these are business authors, self-improvement authors that have been known to have an engaging style. So Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Seth Godin, Simon Sinek, Daniel Pink, Brene Brown. Some great folks that you know the large language model understands them because they are widely circulated, and you know that they've sold a lot of books. So that could be a good place to start. If you just tell the large language model, hey, write something like Malcolm Gladwell, you're going to get a parody of Malcolm Gladwell. You're going to get sort of a weak imitation or a caricature of Malcolm Gladwell, where it start talking all about the tipping point, or if it's Seth Godin, it might start talking about comparing everything to a purple cow. And may help, I don't know. I've had some luck doing it that way, but I think just giving it examples, again, is the way to go. Here's the style example that I am uploading. This is Maria Popova. Got that from her fantastic blog, but I'm quickly going to replace this with my own style once I get up and running. Back in Claude, I'm going to fire up a new chat just so we can start fresh when we're uploading these and there's no confusion with the previous conversations. I'm going to upload these 3 files here. And now I'm going to use this prompt. I'm working on a book. I'd like your help creating the first draft of chapter 2 in this case. I have attached a detailed outline of the book, and then I've put in parentheses here the outline, just calling out very specifically, naming the names of these pieces to make it very easy for the large language model to match what's in the prompt so they don't have to guess which document I'm referring to. Also, I've added a detailed outline of the chapter and an example of the style I am trying to match. Please return only the introduction for my review, then we'll continue to move through each section of the outline one by one. So in this way, you're focusing it on that first step, just getting that introduction, ideally getting a few hundred good words for that, and then moving through each section. Okay, and it has returned. Claude has returned an introduction here, several paragraphs outlining the chapter and kind of telling us what it's going to be about. Now I'm saying please continue with the next section in the chapter 2 outline. And now it's moving into section 2 of chapter 2, and it's keeping these titles related to the outline, which I think is helpful. At this point, you might be tempted to edit those out, but I would suggest, at least as you're doing this the first time, potentially keeping these in and editing later. You can always edit them out later, but they might be helpful as you are moving through this process so you can zoom in and clearly articulate each section. If you want to fix up a certain section, it can be helpful to have these designations when you're communicating with the large language model, rather than just saying, oh, you know that part about the jackal-headed god, you can just say A1. Or something like that in that section, clearly pinpointing what you want to focus on in the editing, which we'll get to here shortly. I'm just copying and pasting that same prompt. Please continue to the next section in the chapter 2 outline. We've done the introduction, then the second section, and this is section 3. Really cool. I'm a huge fan of mythology. I love seeing all this about dogs. I've repeated that for all 7 sections of the chapter and pulled together this chapter 2 that comprises all of that outline that we created. And I just ran this through a word checker. This is wordcounter.net. I use this quite a lot. And we are at 3,168 words. So right at our average of what a normal chapter should be. But this chapter 2 needs a lot of work. And now we're getting into the editing phase. And this is probably the heaviest lift. This is where you want to focus your efforts. There are a ton of different kinds of editing, and I learned a lot about these running my content marketing agency. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, these are the areas that a lot of people struggle with when they say they don't like what the AI comes up with. Then the AI doesn't know if it means you needs to change a couple words or if it needs to rewrite the whole thing, and it kind of does neither one nor the other. So being very precise with it in how you want to edit it and move from these big picture developmental editing prompts down into structural editing, so organization and large scale sections, then moving even more granular into the grammar, mechanics, word choice, and then into the line editing, so the sentence level polish, proofreading, looking for final typos, which is something, if the AI is generating a lot of it, you don't have to spend a lot of time with this. But if you do start adding and manually editing, it can be really helpful at the end to just say, hey, look for any grammatical errors, and then say recommend changes. So instead of having it edit the draft, sometimes you might want to ask it, hey, don't change everything, just let me know what you recommend. And in that way, you can see if you agree with what it's recommending or not. So let's do that now with chapter 2. So here's the first prompt we're going to use to edit this chapter and start to get it to flow more naturally. It starts, I've attached a chapter of a book I'm working on. This chapter focuses on, and then put a quick brief description or the title. I'd like to make sure that the sections of this chapter transition naturally from one to the other. Please follow the style example also attached. For each transition point, suggest specific revisions to improve the flow between sections. I've dropped in that prompt along with the doc I made from the chapter 2 responses and the style example. And it has created some pretty cool transitions, giving you the current transition as well as the suggested revision. So then you can go in and update that chapter so it flows more smoothly. And obviously you can rework these as much as you want. Spending some time with this. Again, writing a book is a process. It's not going to get it perfect, and you're going to need to do a little of the work, but this will get you a lot of the way there. There are a ton of editing prompts in the cheat sheet, and this is the magic of really making the book shine and be cohesive. I'm going to try another one here. Could any of the sections be rearranged or combined for a better reading experience? Let's see what Claude has to say about this one. Now it's giving you some ideas of how to combine and rearrange these sections to follow a different logical order. So when it comes to editing your chapters together, that's probably a little more challenging. There's a couple different ways you can handle it. Claude should be able to hold your entire book in its context memory. I would for sure start a new chat string, upload your entire book, and ask it for recommendations on how to make sure that it flows smoothly and that it stands as a cohesive book. But this is probably the point where you're going to need to do the most work and the most manual editing, making sure that the book holds together as one piece and doesn't just feel like a bunch of different blog posts copied and pasted together. Now with fiction, this is probably going to be even more challenging. I think nonfiction, there are some advantages making that a little bit easier, as folks are going to be expecting each chapter to be different with maybe some references to other chapters, etc., to make it feel cohesive, where a novel, is inherently different than that. But as I was making this and thinking about it, there is a trend these days in these novels that have very separate and disjointed chapters. So Jonathan Franzen is a contemporary author who I really like, and many of his books jump around quite a bit from chapter to chapter. I'm also just finishing up a book called The North Woods, where each chapter is very separate one from the other, but they all have a clear through line that unites them. So you may want to think about that style, as it is currently in vogue to have the chapters be fairly separate from one another and showing different angles of maybe the same subject matter in various ways, various moments in time. In a way, if this is the style you might be going after, which again is fairly popular and fairly pervasive in many of the books that I've read recently, this could be one angle you take to sort of capitalize on some of the weaknesses of these large language models and some of the challenges with turning your book into a cohesive whole. So just a few thoughts there on how to chain these chapters together and ensure that your book holds together as one unified piece. And as you go through the process, you're inevitably going to be writing some of this yourself and making some manual edits. So then pulling it back through and asking it to do some copy editing with these prompts, suggesting better word choices, identifying cliches or overly used words, correct use of jargon, etc., line editing, proofreading, verifying facts. This one is huge. I would use a tool called Perplexity. So you would pull in the chapter, or maybe it's just a section of the chapter. This is especially for nonfiction books, and asking it to double check all stats, dates, names, etc. You can also ask Claude to say what would be some interesting data that might support this chapter. And since Claude can't access the internet currently, you would then take its response of the requested data and put that into Perplexity, saying, hey, please find this data with the sources. Then you would pull the response from Perplexity as it does its research back into Claude and ask it to update the draft with the data and the sources. So this is a big one, as you don't want to hallucinate. The models are getting much better about the hallucinations or the way that they can make things up. Perplexity has always been my go-to for double checking, making sure there is some accuracy, along with really just spot checking everything and making sure that it all seems to make logical sense. That pulls us right into the ethics and plagiarism section here. So these AI models are trained on a lot of information, and there is a chance that they're going to recreate things that are already out there in the world. So your first line of defense are these tools like Turnitin or Grammarly. They can look for plagiarism. So, you want to avoid unintentional plagiarism by making sure that you do a plagiarism check using those. And that's not foolproof. The idea is that through the editing process and through some of the manual work that you would be working this over enough that the chances of that happening are slim to none. And of course, when in doubt, cite. That is a great rule of thumb if you're working in the nonfiction space. So familiarizing yourself with citation styles and making sure that when you're pulling stuff from Perplexity that you are citing it appropriately. This not only safeguards you from errors, but it also adds a lot of credibility to your work. I think, new writers might think of this as weakening their work, that it didn't all come from their brain, etc. But as academic writers and researchers know, that all that they do is citations. So don't be afraid to cite, to do that research with Perplexity and pull in your sources there. And so far, we've focused a lot on nonfiction, on business type books. Fiction is a whole nother beast. And here are some prompts for this. I've got some ideas from Stephen King and from Sol Stein kind of baked into these, but creating backstories. So thinking through who your characters are, making them as three-dimensional as possible, identifying their motivations and their clashes, adding subtext, and trying to really get some subtlety in the characters, and subtlety into the dialogue can be especially tricky. World building, and this is especially important if you're doing any sort of fantasy or sci-fi, really using the AI to go deep into your world and understand things and help you generate ideas about that world that may not be apparent, right off the bat. Consistency checks, so editing your fiction to make sure that the world holds up and there's not one chapter where magic is possible and another chapter where that magic is impossible. There's a lot of shows that suffer from that. So there's a ton here to think through and to improve your drafts and improve your characters and your worlds. These are things that can be applied to nonfiction as well. So thinking about the narrative structure, thinking about how you can make it even more personal, and diving into the scene settings there to really bring some life to your nonfiction. Also thinking about pacing and tension in nonfiction, which is often overlooked as you're just kind of throwing out facts sometimes. So that's the majority of what I had for you today. In the cheat sheet, there are more ideas from Stephen King's toolbox about leveling up your vocabulary, being careful with grammar, style tools, etc., how to use that toolbox. And there's a bunch here from Saul Stein about how to edit your fiction and get your hooks and your storylines and your pacing to all work well. I think the editing is the critical part here, and especially when it comes to fiction. Saul Stein's book on writing is as good as it gets, and these are some of my notes from that. I've got many pages in here of notes. I've gone through that book probably 10 times. So awesome. Thanks a ton for getting through this with me. Good luck with your book. Again, there's a cheat sheet version of this with, I would say, well over 100 prompts. And if you're getting something out of this, that cheat sheet can really help you accelerate. As you've seen, just copy and pasting things from the cheat sheet straight into the large language model. When you become one of my Patreon subscribers, you get access immediately not only to this cheat sheet, but over 70 others and more every week. So thousands and thousands of prompts for all different types of use cases. Oh, I also have some coaching options available in there. There's our meetings at Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, where you can just pop in, ask some questions, work with some other awesome people who are getting a ton out of these AI models. There's some one-on-one coaching in there as well. But let me know in the comments, what did you struggle with here, and what are you looking to do with AI? Please give me a thumbs up if you like this, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you on the next video.
Make your dreams come true. True.